Hello and welcome to our online forum discussing preventing family violence and the critical role of language services in legal settings. Before we begin, the Polaron and Myriad Kofkin team would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians throughout Australia and their continued connection to land, sea, and the community. We will begin in just a moment, but first I will take you through some housekeeping before we get started with the panel discussion. So our agenda today is broken down into 3 sections. We will begin with our moderator and panel introductions before posing a question to our audience. After this, the panel discussion will begin before we finish off with a live Q&A and conclusions at 11:30 a.m. So this forum is brought to you by Polaron Language Services and Myriad Kofkin Global. So, who is Polaron? Established in 2000, Polaron is an award-winning language services company which provides excellence in interpreting and translations. With multicultural communities at the heart of everything we do, we actively participate in local events and support social causes, which enables us to directly engage with diverse populations and foster a deeper understanding of communities' distinct needs and preferences. Our partner, Myriad Kofkin Global, are a specialist consultancy company with a multidisciplinary team offering expertise in developing equity and inclusion, intersectional practice, and social justice capabilities and competencies. Our moderator for this forum is the wonderful Maria Dimopoulos. Maria brings well over 30 years of continuous contribution to building strategic capability within a breadth of sectors across Australia. She's worked across all tiers of government advocating for human rights and social justice-informed policy, areas that have been a lifelong passion and professional commitment. Now, let's welcome our panelists today. First off, I would like to introduce you to Miriam Zahid. Miriam is an award-winning Afghan-Australian human rights champion, diversity and inclusion practitioner, and she founded the Afghan Women on the Move organization. Thank you for joining us today, Miriam. Next up, I would like to give a warm welcome to Eva Hussein, the founder and director of Polaron Language Services. Eva is a certified translator, interpreter, and NATI examiner, and also a member of various networks and boards, including the Victorian Refugee Health Network. Over the years, Eva has contributed to the translation and interpreting industry, the Polish and Jewish community globally, and through her volunteer work. Her lived experience as a refugee from Poland fuels her passion for community work and bridge building. Thank you for joining us, Eva. We would also like to welcome Tanya Farha, CEO of Safe and Equal, a merged identity of 2 organizations, the Domestic Violence Resource Centre Victoria and Domestic Violence Victoria. Previously, Tanya has held executive positions across the Victorian Departments of Justice and Community Safety and Premier and Cabinet, including as the CEO of former Office of Prevention of Women's Equality. Tanya has also worked at UN Women for over 4 years as a policy specialist in the Ending Violence Against Women section and worked for Victoria Police for over 9 years to improve its responses to family violence, sexual assault, and child abuse. It's great to have you, Tanya. Following Tanya, then, we have Emily Dimitriadis. Emily is a former migration lawyer and Darebin City Councillor, and she is committed to making a positive difference in the community. Thank you, Emily, for joining us. And finally, we welcome Maha Zukar. Maha is currently an acting senior sergeant at Victoria Police and has been for over 20 years. She has worked in various areas on and off duty, advocating for the multicultural communities and advising Victorian Police on proactive approaches. She is also a qualified NATI interpreter in Arabic. Her work in the domestic violence and forced and underage marriages section have earned her the introduction into the Victorian Honour Roll for Women, as well as the Australian Police Medal. She is a founder and past president of Victorian Police Muslim Association, the founder and past deputy chair for Victorian Police Called Network, and co-founder and current deputy chair for Victoria Police Women of Colour Network. It is absolutely fantastic to have you, Maha. She may be joining our panelists slightly later than the rest of our panels, as she is currently acting as a senior sergeant and in court. So before we get started with the panel discussion, I would like to pose a question to our audience. And please feel free to discuss this in the chat box throughout the forum so we can get a bit of engagement going through with our audience. A recent study from the Australian National Research Organisation of Women's Safety reveals that communities with lower English proficiency affected by family violence are likely to experience language barriers when trying to access these support services. So, how can we begin to combat the language barriers faced by linguistically diverse communities? Please leave any of your answers or discussion in the chat box, and we'd be happy to facilitate that throughout. Now I will pass you over to Maria Demopoulos, who will moderate our panel discussion and take you through our core topics of focus.
Thank you so much for that brilliant setting of the scene. Hello, everyone. If I too could start by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from the lands of the Bunurong people, and I would like to extend my respect to all elders, both past and present, and to any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander members of the community who might be joining us today. It is important to recognise that language and culture are a very integral part of that recognition. There are well over, I understand, 250 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages across this nation, and it is important that we make every effort to preserve those languages in all of the work that we do. I can't believe our luck in having the panel that we do. Each of them will come from a very unique point of view in terms of responding to this issue of access to language services, particularly in family and domestic violence. As we can see, the topic areas will be particular to family and domestic violence, but I think it's important to acknowledge that this is a conversation that is sporadic in terms of the importance that and significance that it receives in both public discourse but also in government policy. So a very important conversation, and I know that each of you will benefit from the insights and wisdom of our panel members. What is the impact of language barriers on accessing language support and services? And why are culturally responsive strategies for effective interpreting and translation in family violence contexts so important for us? Frameworks and policies promoting language access in the family violence and legal sectors are ad hoc. Why is it important that we get some consistency around those policies and frameworks? And finally, it is a whole of government and agency response. So collaboration is a fundamental part of meaningful strategies to address these gaps and deficiencies. So those collaborative efforts to enhance accessibility and support become a key part of the strategy that we'll be talking about today. So again, I want to thank our panelists who have made the time to be with us today. I'm trying to recreate a couch type scenario by sitting on my own couch here, because as many of you who know me, my preferred style is to be in that room with you, but I am getting my head around these virtual forums for discussion. But I'm going to start the conversation by inviting Eva, if I could. I know your passion for language services is one that has really characterised the conversations that you and I have had, Eva, so many years. But you've come across so many anecdotes, so many experiences where those challenges that are faced by our multicultural communities really do come to the fore. We also know that some of those challenges are quite unique when we're talking about the use of interpreters in family and domestic violence settings. Eva, can I invite you to really open up that conversation around those challenges and give us some insights into what those challenges have looked like from where you've been?
Sure, Marianne, thank you for that question. I do have to ask you one of my own, though. Where were you in 1987?
Where was I in 1987? My goodness, I think I had just finished law school at Monash University and deciding whether I should live up to my mother's expectations, which were to get a nice comfy office in Collins Street and join a large legal firm like Slater's or something like that, or whether I should go down the human rights law pathway, which I ended up doing. Ever so to this very day, my mother still insists that I would have made a very, very good commercial lawyer, but human rights was where my heart and passion was. How about you? Where were you in 1987?
Well, because one thing that people might not know, but I do know, is that at the time you also worked at women's refuges, right?
I did. In fact, my first job was as a bilingual support worker at what was then known as Refuge Ethnic Workers Program and now called In Touch Multicultural Services. How did you find that out?
Maria, I know everything. You should know this. I know everything and everybody. But let me tell you where I was. And our paths did not cross at the time. But I was in women's refuges, 5 different ones in 1987. So I do have, I guess, in a roundabout way, answering a question, that lived experience of not understanding. And I think when it comes to language services, although nearly 40 years have gone by, some things have improved and some things haven't. So when I was going through, really hard times as a newly arrived refugee in Australia through domestic violence in 1987, not once did anybody say, hey, do you need an interpreter, even though I've been here just for a short time. So I know that interpreters are more readily accessible. But are they really? Are we really, focusing on making sure that people understand not just the language, but the process? It is a very stressful time for people, and that includes children and also perpetrators, of course, where not understanding the language, not understanding the system is something that's still happening, I think, and providing appropriate language services is one way that we can all contribute to, helping people access services, understand the system and the language that's being used, which can be a little bit exclusive. Just before I hand it back to you, I also can tell you that some people still don't understand the difference between interpreter and translator. So with that in mind, interpreter speaks, translator writes, okay? 2 different skills, 2 different certifications through NAATI. Obviously, being an interpreter myself, I would encourage everyone to look into how
and they are different skill sets, though, aren't they, Eve? I mean, this is the thing. We do often hear people use those terms synonymously as if they're the same thing. But the skill sets and the end product, of course, or the outcome is significantly different. So it's not just semantics. It's an important distinction that we need to get right.
That's right. And I think, I do both, but that's because I'm an introvert and an extrovert. So being an interpreter does require good people skills, and translators tend to hide behind computer screens. Being both is great because you can research your terminology, for example, when you work as a translator, and then go and shine in courts, where you are elevated to a bit of a pedestal because, without you, nobody understands. 2 different skills are set and personalities that you need to be able to do this work.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Eva, for really getting clarity around that distinction, because I understand from government officials that there is a massive budget implication too when people get it wrong and a translator turns up when in fact you're needing an interpreter, all of that loss of budget could actually be avoided. It costs money getting it wrong. Yeah.
And it does. And, you know, like I've been around for some time, and I can tell you that we do waste a lot of money in this space, and we waste a lot of opportunities to get it right. So just by
through
understanding
that simple lack of awareness. Yeah.
Right. Or, you know, producing things, translating things that people can't read because they can't read in any language. So I think, you know, we hear about AI and all kinds of technological advances, but at the end of the day, when someone's in crisis, you need to get them proper communication tools, I guess, and an interpreter can be one, you know, a conduit to systems, to services, and to understanding of what's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Eva. Tanya Faha, you're the CEO of Safe and Equal, the peak body for family and domestic violence services. And when you hear Eva talk about some of those challenges and barriers to accessing language support services, is that similar to what you're seeing? I mean, before we move into that very specific legal setting, which of course adds another layer of complexity, are you able to share more generally what some of those challenges around accessing language services more generally might be when you're out there working with family and domestic violence agencies?
Oh, well, firstly, thanks for the invitation to be here today, and it's a really important topic. And can I also add to acknowledgement of land? I'm on Bunurong land as well, so acknowledge their elders past and present. Yeah, I think, I mean, I've also had some context working in multicultural affairs as well, so I kind of understand the impact of this. I think one of the challenges out when you're working on the front line is the actual access to legal interpreters, and I take your point about the difference. Interpreters who are actually knowledgeable about family violence, because I think family violence, you know, the way the laws and the system is set up in each community, in each culture is different. And there might be certain things that are not immediately interpretable or translatable. So people need to understand the context in which you are requesting the interpreting service, to understand the way in which family violence is understood in law here in this country, so that you can actually make sure that you get the right interpreter to be able to support the survivor at the front line. Because very often when you're trying to explain, if you're applying, for example, through the civil jurisdiction for an intervention order, what is the level of evidence that you need to be able to present for that? What might the police need to be able to progress that application for you? And these are all things that take not just interpreting expertise, but knowledge of family violence. So it's really important you know which interpreters to access at what time. But also, I think one of the challenges I remember from working in multicultural affairs was, particularly for smaller language groups, being able to find interpreters that may not be tied to that family as well, because I think there was a lot of concern for people to access interpreters because they might be known to the family or the community. So these are all the challenges that services have to work with as well. But they're just some of the things that are kind of most pertinent, I think.
And we obviously want to pick up on some of the things that you're saying, so I'll explore that a little bit more. But Emily Demetriadis, can I invite you in at this stage? You're a human rights and migration lawyer. You've seen some fairly traumatizing cases, women and children in very challenging and traumatizing situations. From your perspective, through that lens of a lawyer, what are some of the challenges that you see? Are you able to share any of that with the audience?
Yes, thank you, Maria, and thank you to everyone for having me here today. I also want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Wurrung people, who are the traditional owners of the land on which I reside on tonight, and their today actually, and their elders past, present, and emerging.
I don't think you've had much sleep knowing what you were doing last night.
Yes.
So probably
I was preparing.
from morning into night at the moment. The work of a human rights lawyer never ends, Emily Demetriadis.
That you are correct. Unfortunately, in migration law, we do see a lot of these cases, and the challenges are quite broad. But I will try and keep it brief because first and foremost, engaging an interpreter does require financial constraints on clients, particularly when they have little money to begin with. And many of these clients also have concerns about confidentiality, which we heard from Tanya as well, particularly when the cohort is very small. The community that they come from is very small. And that also brings in issues of trusting an interpreter, particularly when there's serious concerns of, serious factors in play, such as family violence. And generally what we see in these cases is that the client will request a family member or a friend to interpret instead of a qualified interpreter as well. So one example that I've recently seen was that, and it's also actually quite common in this particular scenario is common with other migration lawyers, is the instance where a woman has come to Australia on a partner visa and has left her child back home. And in this instance, the child was in India with the husband's parents. So prior to coming to Australia, the woman was promised a job by a family friend who has a takeaway business in Melbourne. And when the woman arrived in Melbourne, she immediately started work at the family friend's business, but she was paid a lot less than minimum wage and she's been working many unpaid hours. So at home, unfortunately, she's also been physically, financially, and emotionally abused by her husband, and she has no family and friends here. Now, what she tells us is that she can't report her boss because back home, her family will be killed. It's a very small community. She also says that she can't report her husband because she'll never see her daughter again. And she says that she can't afford the legal fees because her husband controls what very little money she actually gets paid. And while this is not an uncommon scenario that we've seen in many cases, imagine if this woman could not speak English. And we've also seen that where I remember another client who had newly arrived in Australia and she didn't know the language. So she initially attended our firm with her husband as the interpreter, and we immediately realized the power dynamic that was at play. So the husband was answering questions on her behalf, and she was just looking at the floor, about basic questions that she could have answered, such as her name. So we advised the husband that a qualified interpreter was required in this situation, and he expressed serious concerns about financial concerns about costs, and said he would instead get a friend to interpret for his wife, who was supposedly an interpreter. Now that also causes a lot of other problems particularly in a legal scenario. And while we had no power to enforce the requirement to actually have a qualified interpreter be engaged, the husband did eventually agreed. But on occasion, he would still bring his wife together with the interpreter, this friendly interpreter, his friend of an interpreter, to the office, like to drop off documents and stuff, while he was waiting downstairs for both of them to return. So in those sorts of situations, there's there's issues, there could potentially be issues of family violence that would arise that, that lawyers would definitely, as Tanya said, would also be important for lawyers to actually be informed about how to deal with these situations as well. In other situations, we've actually seen young children who attend our firm to interpret on behalf of their parents, and that's also a concern because, as Eva said, families are actually very they're in dire situations, and when the child actually goes through and hears what the mother has to say, and sometimes she has to explain it in a domestic violence situation, and the child's interpreting, it actually can become quite distraught, not only for the mother but also for the child.
Absolutely.
Further, sorry, I've just got another example, if that's okay.
Yeah,
but in refugee law, most of our clients, particularly who fled war-torn countries, generally have little trust for governments as well, the police and the legal system. So another client that I remember, she'd been sexually abused by authorities in her hometown. So when she came for assistance to us for her visa, she had very little trust, not only in us, but also on the legal system. She had no family or friends here to help her. And in this situation for us, it was important to engage a qualified lawyer, but one that actually understood both cultures, who actually understood the government and the systems that were in place in her hometown and that what she'd actually been through, but also understanding the Australian system and the the cultures that and the differences in culture that arise. So yes, there are certainly many challenges for people who have to navigate the legal system, and English isn't one of their primary languages, and generally, unfortunately, their experiences are quite negative in this case. So yeah, it's quite concerning.
Thank you. I mean, there's so much
in
what you've said, Emily, ranging from the importance of actually using qualified, accredited interpreters, because, of course, the impact, as you rightly pointed out, of having family members or family friends and children. My goodness, you would have thought that this is a topic that we'd actually addressed 30 years ago. I recall talking about the same thing. We would never ask an Anglo-Australian child to navigate or interpret those experiences of distress, trauma and violence. Why and how could we possibly think that it's an okay thing to do with a 10-year-old child, and with very little appreciation of the vicarious trauma that might produce? There are obviously a range of challenges that each of you have presented, in terms of, and I can see from some of the comments that our audience has provided in the chat box as well, getting the right dialects, issues of confidentiality. I mean, that whole issue of accessing smaller languages when we haven't had an opportunity to get some accreditation in those language groups. Well, but Eva, can I ask you now to give us some insight into some of the commentary that we hear from time to time, which is as great as and as necessary and vital as language services are. From time to time, we do see interpreters, particularly in family violence cases, where issues of judgment might creep in, where confidentiality, as our panelists have identified, might become an issue, that fear that other members of the community will find out. I mean, what if I can turn to the next slide with the next question? There has been more and more discussion about the importance of interpreters and other language service providers being able to understand family and domestic violence, having a deeper appreciation of what that experience for victim survivors might look like, and why it is so important that things like confidentiality are maintained. I mean, in your view, what are some of those issues of training, and why are we still asking for some national framework around it? Or maybe it exists. I know there's a few questions there, Eva, but can you shed some light on some of this?
Sure, a great question and a very big one to answer. But can I just firstly encourage everybody to reserve the word interpreter for interpreters, okay? Family members, not interpreters. Children, not interpreters. They may be advocates, they may be friends, they may be whoever they are, they're not interpreters. So I think if we get the language right in the first place, and, we wouldn't call it psychologists, family member a psychologist. So we do have a PR issue in our industry, in that people actually think that, speaking another language is good enough to step in and interpret for people. But of course, around using family members or even children, there's so much risk. And that's one of the things that hasn't changed since 1987, Maria, unfortunately. We still expose ourselves and people to risk in that regard. Now, look, may I just paint a quick picture of the industry? So interpreters in Australia, for the most part, are migrant and refugees. Most are women, so something like 70% of interpreters are women. And interpreters do not get paid well. If you think of someone graduating year 12, not many think, I'll become an interpreter because it's a great career option. It just doesn't happen. So people often end up in this industry, in this profession accidentally. There's a lot of part-timers. There are many people that aren't, necessarily committed to the profession. And training is essentially, training opportunities few and far between, honestly. So therefore, it is hard to maintain that consistency that you would expect from a profession. If we're going to call ourselves interpreters, professional interpreters, we need to be professional. And so in Australia, we have NAATI, which is the National Authority for Accreditation of Translators and Interpreters. And their job is to test people and give them certification that then gets, every 3 years, it gets recertified. So you have to provide proof of professional practice and professional development. Their certification comes in 62 languages. In Australia, we speak about 300. So there's quite a gap in how many people are certified. And it's not possible to provide certification in the other smaller languages sometimes because there are no examiners. It's a very, very complex picture. So just getting back to your question about what's happening and why people might be...
Eva, just on that though, that's a very real issue then, because I do hear service providers, legal practitioners say, with the best of intentions, we really tried to get an accredited interpreter, but the language was just not available to us. Are there strategies though that we could use? I know that one of the things that some language service providers have said to me is often with the client, they will be multilingual. So it's actually worth exploring the range of languages that they may speak, because you might be surprised that they can speak Arabic just as fluently as they can speak Dinka, for example.
Right.
Is that a strategy? I mean, because it is a real problem, isn't it?
It is. And for the newer and emerging communities in Australia where we just do not have certified people, that's even a bigger issue. I think, there's something that people that want to work with interpreters or need interpreting services need to consider. And that is, how can we be a bit more creative than just going to one service provider and booking one and hoping for the best? Yeah. So there's the phone. So none of these options that I'm going to run through are perfect. But there's phone, there's video. There are, people that aren't certified maybe at the highest level, but might be able to provide language services. But there's been some research done about, firstly, how much it costs not to provide an interpreter to a service, because if you think about it, someone that's caught in the system will cost the system more if they don't understand what's happening. But also, it is important to understand that sometimes providing a bad interpreter creates more risk than not providing one. There's some research done around that. So if I had a magic wand, there'd be an interpreter in Australia in every language 24/7, but the reality is that it's just not like that. So I would encourage service providers to really understand the landscape. There are in Victoria, New South Wales and South Australia, there are scholarships that the government provides for training of interpreters with RMIT and other training institutions, but it takes years, right? So to build that capacity, it takes a long time. So no magic wand, but that curiosity and really, and also if you find an interpreter that's great, stick to them is my advice too.
Yeah. Tanya, what would you like to see interpreters know about family and domestic violence? Because I think more and more we're recognizing that it does present some very real and unique challenges in that communication process. If we were going, and I know there's some training frameworks that are out there, there's some courses that interpreters are encouraged to undertake, but if there were 3 key things that you thought were really important that interpreting and language services should really integrate into that knowledge base or skill sets for interpreters, what would they be from your perspective?
Yeah, it's a really good question, actually. I'll probably have trouble limiting it to 3. But can I just say one thing about children?
Yes, absolutely.
It's not just the trauma of the interpreting. Children are victims as well. So
that's a very good point.
We're re-victimizing children. And especially when both parents require interpreting. So police often show up. Maha, I see you're online now, so sorry to speak about police, but very often police will arrive on the scene, and they might not be able to access an interpreter because the code of practice says they should, but if they can't, they may use the children for both parents. But then that leads me on to the other point about, of course, children being in the environment are victims. But the second point about that is the underlying power and control by the perpetrator on that family. And so what people are saying may not be immediately what is happening, right? Because they are so fearful of the repercussions from the perpetrator. So if the interpreter doesn't understand the dynamics that might be happening there, so not just the expression of violence that they might have showed up, but also the ongoing coercive control, power and control that is being experienced, then they might not understand that it's not, that they might need to talk to the parties separately. They might need to, engage in a different way to sort of build trust with the survivor to really get the full story, because we also know survivors minimize, right, in terms of describing the situation. So that's one thing. I think also interpreters need to understand not just the system, but the law in relation to family violence. What are the evidence thresholds? So when we're talking about intervention orders, balance of probability, evidence-based, when we're talking about criminal, beyond reasonable, we're talking about understanding what is the evidence that might help support, so they know what to sort of help the survivor, what they might ask further clarification on if the survivor is trying to just tell the story. So I think that's really, really important. And then I think that they also need to understand access to legal services themselves, independent sources of information for that person, outside of, if the police are there, or if they're not, not always, police are not always there. We know that, police are not the only first responders to this issue, but also knowing that the woman has, also the survivor has access to some independent legal information that can help her, make decisions. And the interpreter is an important part of that. But I think they're really three important things, I think, that we need to know. But I just really wanted to make that point about children, because it's not just re-trauma, it's re-victimizing them, So, yeah.
That's absolutely. I mean, the point about trauma, though, Eva, just before I do move on to the question then from a practitioner's perspective, but often I think we forget that the interpreter themselves may be going through a process of vicarious trauma, listening to these examples, often extremely horrific examples. Emily gave some insight into what those might be. There isn't a lot of talk about trauma-informed responses to interpreters as well in the process of communication. Is that something that you see as being talked about more or being addressed?
Talked about more, yes. Addressed, no. So again, as I said, most interpreters in Australia are from migrant and refugee backgrounds. Many are women. Many have, just like myself, have had lived experience of domestic violence. So another example to contribute to the ones that Emily's provided is, I remember being in Dandenong Magistrates Court some years ago now, and going through, the process with the worker from a refuge and the woman I was interpreting for, and the magistrate saying to her, she was applying for intervention order, and the magistrate saying, which I had to interpret for her, saying to her, well, but there's no visible signs of violence, and refusing the order. So, and something very similar happened to me. So I was just winded. Here I am, expecting to be professional, and I was as much as I could, but I just, it's really affected me afterwards, and there was no process for me to debrief about that unless I had my own way of managing what I've just heard. So it is still happening, and you know, we're not talking about solutions yet, but one of the things that everybody could do is just ask the interpreter how they're going. So brief them first. So all the things that Tanya's mentioned, you know, things like terminology, you know, using the right language, understanding how to translate certain terms, understanding the legal system or what you're about to interpret is really important. But also the tail end of it, where you may have been exposed to something really traumatic and you've just witnessed it, and you're supposed to go home or to your next interpreting session, and you know, you will burn out if you're not looking after yourself, or you know, you might not be aware of how much this is affecting you. So I think, you know, interpreting agencies, governments, users of interpreting services should indeed do more just to make sure that interpreters are looked after, because there aren't enough of them to go around, and you want them to continue this important work. I'll just add a very quick thing before I hand back to you, Maria, and that is, when I was doing a lot of active interpreting, the last thing I wanted to do is spread rumors. Like I hear that people say, oh, it's a small community, they're going to gossip. Maybe that happens sometimes, but most interpreters really want to mind their own business. They're not interested in engaging that way. You know, it's not a perfect industry, but I think for the most part, interpreters just want to come in, do the job, and go home safe. And that worry from maybe the communities or professionals comes potentially from the fact of not understanding what the interpreter's job is. So when you walk into a situation whereby you are supposed to interpret, no one introduces you. You know, so one thing that could be done is to say, you know, to the non-English speaker, hey, this is an interpreter. Their job is to interpret. They keep everything confidential. You know, it takes 30 seconds to do that little introduction. And the more seasoned interpreters will do that themselves. Because, you know, if you think about it, some of the newer communities have never worked with one. So like if you include the interpreter respectfully in the process and see them as your colleague, as someone that's there to support you. This is the other thing, very quickly, the point I'll make. People say, oh, look, the interpreter is for the Italian little old lady, or they're here for the Dari speaker. No, they're there for you so that you can do your job as if there was no language barrier. That's important to remember. So when you see them as your colleague and as a partner in this exchange, which is often very difficult, you know, we're talking crisis points, that can really help the situation, and also explaining everyone's role. My name is Emily, I'm a lawyer. This is Eva, she's your interpreter. Everything that's said here is confidential. It takes 5 seconds. And then at the end of the exchange, is there anything you'd like to discuss? Is there any way I can support you? It doesn't take long to do.
Yeah. Thank you, Eva. You've covered quite a range of important factors that I think are about seeing the role as integral, seeing the role of interpreters and translators as a skilled one, and paying that respect, I think, to the process. As you rightly said, it's not a perfect system. There are gaps, and certainly we hear many anecdotes where perhaps the interpreter has kind of gone a bit beyond their role in the sense of expressing judgment about family and domestic violence. But overall, language services, as we're saying, are a critical part of things like access to justice. I mean, the right to be understood in any proceeding is a core part of any human rights framework, surely. So thank you for really bringing some of those issues to light. I do want to think about, as much as we've been discussing training and resources to equip language service providers, what are the kinds of things that you think from a legal perspective and a policing perspective? Senior Sergeant Maha Sukar, I think you've managed to join us at the moment. Hello. Yay.
Hello, I dodged the bullet. I had to go to court and I wasn't requested to go give evidence. So that's why I'm here.
Well, thank you for making
And
the
a family
time.
violence case, right?
Yes, well, and as someone that I know has worked for so long in that interface between policing and family and domestic violence, with that added layer of having extraordinary insight into cultural and linguistic issues, from your perspective, when you think about policing and interpreting, what are the sorts of things that you think are important for police officers to know about using interpreters effectively?
Great question. I've been writing vicarious notes for the last 10, 20 minutes you've been talking. There's a lot of things that they talked that Eva and Tanya and Emily have covered that I'd like to cover as well from a different perspective. But from policing perspective, we teach them from day one in the academy the use of interpreter. It's part of the, if you watch American movies, the preamble when they want to arrest someone, we have to call an interpreter for you, we have to organize. So they give the options when someone's under arrest. But in family violence perspective, let me backtrack for a second. I'm not saying all police officers do a good job, and I'm not saying all police officers do a bad job. There are really good people out there that are doing their best to do their, the best thing, especially in family violence perspective, and dealing with different people from different cultures. But I'm sure there's always bad stories here, there, and everywhere. So we teach them how to use it. We tell them what to do. We tell them that when you, part of the training is when you ask for an interpreter to introduce themselves, introduce why the interpreter's there, make sure that the interpreter is from the same dialect, if applicable. A job that I've been working on lately is helping the interpreters and the translators work when they translated the wrong things when it comes to context, as Eva and Tanya talked about. So, for example, a swear word in Arabic, I'm an Arabic speaker, might be used as a way of threatening, and someone might be charged with threatening someone else, although all he said was a swear word. But if you translate it outside of context or literal translation, it ends up with a charge of threat to kill. So this is where I got involved a bit to say, well, no, hang on, it depends on the context, it depends on the situation. So we try our best with police, but don't forget police work on adrenaline. They are working outside on the road for hours and hours and hours. They get called for family violence. They have to deal with it's part of their role. They have to, and they have to do it properly as well. And they're liable and they can be charged and kicked out of the job if they don't do a good job. In relation to using children, sometimes, and I've seen it myself, sometimes we use the children as a start. Okay, tell us what's the situation. Are you safe? And then if they say yes or no, and then we'll move to an interpreter if we can find one. But as you know, sometimes at midnight, 3 a.m. in the morning, finding an interpreter that comes on the phone is an issue. So what they're doing right now, the new constables and the new people who are technology savvy, they're using AI. Whether I agree or disagree with the translation via AI, sometimes we need just the basic information. Do we need to separate? Do we need to make sure everyone's safe first? And then we'll grab ourselves an interpreter when we need to. So there is a lot of work being done. There's, especially with body worn camera right now, no one can dispute anything. Everything is there, everything's recorded. And if the camera is not on, the person is in trouble for not having their cameras on. So I'm going to throw it back and people are going to hate me.
Can I say though, one of the criticisms, if I could put it that way, that sometimes we receive is that police officers will use the alleged perpetrator to interpret. How do we get the message across that it's really important that that not happen? Because as we've heard from some of the panelists, that dynamic around power and control, the extent to which the perpetrator may be really dictating how the narrative comes across. Can we avoid this? Is this a message that you try to get across in the training, that we not use the alleged perpetrator to do that?
It is not just part of the training, it's part of the policy and the code of conduct, as Tanya called it. Unfortunately, as I said, depends on the situation, and they shouldn't be using. All we need, if the only thing we teach them, and it's written there, to ask what language it is, if anyone's safe. Now, if the police are abusing those powers and are using it, please complain. And this is where I want to throw it back, is we need to train the interpreters, the translators, and the community about what police can and can't do. and what to do if you're not happy with the way you're treated by the police. I know most of the, and it is hard to do that because you're scared of police coming from the background you're coming from. I used to be scared of police. Look what I ended up. You know, so it is hard, and especially in very high volatile situations when the person comes in and you know, at midnight and there was no one else. We need to understand what's happening from the, what I hear is happening right now on the radio, police radio, is anyone who can listen on the radio from a police perspective who speaks this language, give me a call. So they try to get, because Victoria Police right now have a lot of non-English other than English speakers, people who are qualified interpreters, or even someone who can understand the language a bit, by the way, until we find an interpreter. So it is still happening, unfortunately. But what I want from the listeners here today is to report it, to complain about it. It is on the cameras. They can't deny it. And it's adding complexity as well. Can I just comment on what Tanya said about training the interpreters about the local laws and the new laws? Yes, please. Because I've seen a couple of interpreters and translators still referring to laws that have been, you know, gone or changed, or the systems has changed. So it helps as well when we do that. One-on-one or two-on-one, that knowing the context, knowing the background, knowing what's happening. Oh, Eva's not happy. Here we go.
Yeah, please, Eva. And any other panelists, I mean, as I say, if we were actually in the room, we'd be having a fairly dynamic conversation. Oh, here we go, Eva. You've started a trend around putting the hands up. And Emily, I am very conscious that I'm keen to get the perspective through that legal practitioner view as well. So, but Eva, you've got your hand up. So direct comment.
Thank you. And great, thank you, Maha, for your contribution. And it sounds like you're very grassroots and hands-on, and you're seeing all kinds of things. I will just, and there's a lot of conversation from language professionals, which we'll cover shortly. But I wanted to talk about precision of language. So Maria has introduced me to Asunta Maroney. Some time ago, we were in Canberra, and she was telling me about intake forms for victims and survivors of domestic violence and risk assessment. So one of the questions in that is about choking, strangling, because it may, and I'm not an expert in this, but the way she's explained it to me is that if that happens in a situation, then that escalates the risk of the women and children in that situation. So how precise interpreters interpret that particular word can really make a massive difference to someone's life. She also talked to me about another question in the assessment, and that is to do with the perpetrator expressing that they wanted to kill themselves. So when she said that, the first thing that came to my mind was, I like directly translated that into Polish, and what I came up with is commit suicide. Very different. First of all, in English in Australia, we no longer use commit. We say, die by suicide or whatever, but it is a very different concept. So interpreters need to completely agree with Tanya and Emily and Maha that the language needs to be super precise, because it can lead to all kinds of outcomes, including death, or imprisonment. So it is up to each and every interpreter to really understand. But in their defense, what actually happens, you walk into a situation where an intake officer or an assessment officer has a form that you've never seen before. And it's got very precise wording that has been developed over years with specialists. And you somehow are expected to do justice to that form without any preparation, really understanding what these words may, in effect, translated mean or cause or create risk. So it is, exposing people at risk. I will say also that a couple of people commented that interpreters prefer, when we say that we're working with interpreters or engaging interpreters, not using interpreters, using interpreter services. It's a pet hate. So I thought I'll bring it up, and I'll shut up now.
Do I have a right of reply?
Absolutely. And I do think that point about, sorry, I don't know why my video went off then, but I think that point about language is so important, and I do want to acknowledge that there's been a number of comments made by language service professionals that we think about the difference between using an interpreter and really I think retraining ourselves to keep at the forefront of our thinking the high level of professionalism that comes with these skill sets as well. So thanks so much, Eva. Maha, absolutely right of reply. And then Tanya, I'll invite you to make your comment as well, please.
Look, I agree with what Eva said, and I apologize if I said using rather than engaging. And it's something I learned. I haven't engaged interpreters for a while. I'm personally not qualified, but I don't translate or interpret because of the conflict of interest. Another thing I wanted to say about what Eva said is about the language used, definitely. But again, you're gonna hate me. Most of the interpreters we use in Victoria are amazing. They know what they're going, and they know all the time that they're going to go to this. So understanding the MARAM, which is the let me remember how it's what MARAM, multi-agency risk assessment and management, which is a family violence risk assessment. They do it all the time. So if you know you're going to go to family violence, and average interpreters engaged will utilize family violence all the time, should familiarize themselves with the MARAM, familiarize about those questions. It becomes easy. It becomes like muscle memory. They use it all the time. It helps police. It helps the most important thing, helps the victim survivor in this situation. And this is my reply. Sorry about that.
No, you're absolutely right. I think sorry, you're absolutely right. I absolutely agree that interpreters need to be empowered and empower themselves to come with the right terminology, to come with the right skills. It's a lifelong journey. So you can't, get NAATI certification and think, I know everything. And often in our training, we've noticed that we kind of preach to the converted. So people that turn up to training sessions or forums like this are the ones that always come. It's the ones that don't come that can be an issue. So I'm glad that we agree, Maha. There you go.
Absolutely, thank you, Tanya. You had your hand up.
Yeah, two issues. Maha stole my thunder there about MARAM, because I was thinking that there would be no reason why you couldn't make language services should make sure that any interpreters who are doing family violence cases must at least have MARAM identify and refer level. I mean, there's very comprehensive, and that's probably beyond the need required for a language service, but at least to identify those risk factors. And I noticed Assunta there put about strangulation, really critical. Suicidality, another really high risk factor, homicidal thoughts, all these things that are really important. But Maha, just wanted to say something really important to you and police using perpetrators is that some of the very common stories we've been hearing, and I've worked in police, so I have a lot of respect for the work that they do, but one of the consequences of using perpetrators to interpret misidentification, because of course they're going to blame the woman who doesn't speak English, who might be appearing a little, more heightened than the man who seems very calm. And sorry to use gendered language here, but it's just easier to describe the situation for the majority of, and I know that it's not always straightforward like that. But, and so what happens is then police end up charging or applying for an order against the woman and rectify. That has so many consequences for her life, child protection, a whole range of things that then get into trying to undo that is so hard. And I know police are doing some work around rectifying mis-ID, but they are they're like really high consequences, particularly when one partner may not speak English and the other does. So if I can really leave you with that one thought and about why it's so critical to really enforce those policies in VicPol and any police around the country. Sorry, you just happen to be from VicPol, but yeah.
I agree with you. I've been pushing really, really hard lately for that. And for the past more than 12 months, they had 4 or 5 cases that I've dealt with to support after the fact with misidentification. Please put more from your perspective as well, being the CEO of a great organizer put pressure on Victoria Police, on other police services as well, to look into that. As you know, it is the time, everyone's talking about family violence and domestic violence right now, but not many people are going into details about the people who don't speak English very well, that we are missed and they're falling down the cracks. So we need to be pushing harder for that. Although we're only 4 or 5 or 6 or 50% of the community speak another language, it's been forgotten about right now. They're worried about more, in their eyes, more important things, which is not the case. So please put more pressures so we can get it done.
There's certainly some great questions that are coming through, and I'm going to try and weave them into the conversation. We've addressed some of them directly and indirectly, but before I do turn my attention to some of the comments and the questions coming through the chat session, Emily, I know you're someone that has really spent some time talking to other lawyers about the importance of them becoming more aware of how to better engage interpreters and work more effectively with them. What are some of the key skill sets that you're trying to convey to lawyers about, you know, more meaningful engagement with interpreters, particularly again in the family violence scenarios that we've talked about?
Yes, so absolutely. It's so important that lawyers just keep it simple, for instance, particularly in these scenarios where, you know, English proficiency isn't that great. So I think, you know, less legal jargon would be great. Even though sometimes it's a lot easier for us to just use those phrases, it's best to use plain English to communicate clearly and articulately. And I was recently chatting to a lawyer about one of the cases, and we were saying how in a court proceeding, an interpreter had interpreted the phrase execute a warrant to mean execution. And all of a sudden, the members of the public gallery walked out in fear of their lives out of the courtroom. So simple things like that, you know, we can actually use simpler language to ensure that it gets interpreted correctly. And we've also heard from other panel members how important it is to, you know, to actually be very articulate with what is being interpreted as well. And that also leads to lawyers knowing that there are, as Eva said, different levels of qualifications of interpreters, because in some languages, you know, particularly in minority groups, there are very few trained interpreters in Australia. So ensuring that those interpreters are also well informed within the legal system and some of those how to interpret some of those key phrases would be very valuable, not only for lawyers, but also for clients, as well as for the court system. I also think it's necessary for lawyers to know how to effectively work with an interpreter. And Eva mentioned a little bit of this, because, you know, just acknowledging the interpreter as soon as they come in and say, you know, this is Eva, for instance, and this whole conversation will be confidential. Also being aware that of addressing the client. So it's important for when lawyers do have engage an interpreter, that we address the client directly, and we're not actually speaking to the interpreter. So the interpreter is there as a impartial interpreter to interpret what's being said, but they don't actually they aren't there to assist anyone other than to interpret what is being said. So I think that's very important. And I think Eva can correct me if I'm wrong, but the idea is to sit in like a triangle, and then and you face the client as well in these situations.
Yeah, the sitting arrangements are quite important. And one of the things I do, I take notes when I do interpreting, and it's a sign of a good interpreter. Because if you think about it, interpreting cannot be 100% accurate, because you don't know what comes out of people's mouths, especially when there's emotion, where there's stress. So it's my way of holding my gaze down so that people can talk to them directly. So a good seasoned interpreter will arrange the sitting in a way that they just in the background, they blend in and they act as a conduit. So yes, absolutely. Little things like that make all the difference.
Absolutely. And these are little things that most lawyers would easily be able to rectify if they do need to. But I think importantly, I think cross-cultural competency is really important for lawyers. For instance, many lawyers assume, and this is another example that we were discussing recently, that if a client is looking at them directly, that, you know, it's very common that they're not actually telling you the truth if the client's looking at you directly. However, in some cultures, it's actually, particularly for women, you know, if feel vulnerable at that. They're not going to look at you in the eyes. They're actually discouraged from doing that. So then as a lawyer, you'd sometimes think, like some lawyers might think, that that's actually a sign that they're not engaged, they're not telling the truth in the case, but it's actually not. And this also raises the issue that when lawyers do engage interpreters, it's particularly important to to be aware of the gender of the interpreter, and especially in family violence cases, because a lot of women, for instance, may not want to speak to a male interpreter who might be known to them, or may not, or even an impartial one as well. So I think there's a lot of things that lawyers can do very simply that would make the experience a lot better for not only themselves, but also for clients as well, because it's important that we ensure procedural fairness. And it's also important that we also, when we are given instructions, that we are accurately understand exactly what's been asked of us as well. So yeah.
Emily, do you know if it is mandatory for lawyers to at least ask the question? I mean, this is the thing, isn't it? That while we're trying to really get across the message to the legal system that it's a fundamental part of justice, surely it's a cornerstone of our legal system, that in order to be able to participate in proceedings that are going to impact your life in this case, you have a right to be understood and to understand. But I have to say, I don't practice law anymore, but I have to say the shortfalls and the gaps in the legal system are profound. Isn't it time that we really tried to embed this into mandatory policy frameworks, into making sure that the legislation itself is passed, that the government agencies are really understanding the importance and significance of language services as part of any democratic process. But are you aware of any policy frameworks, Emily? And I might ask others too on the panel.
Yes. So unfortunately, you are correct, Maria. There is no mandatory requirement to engage an interpreter other than in criminal proceedings. So in court, in the criminal proceedings, you are required to engage an interpreter. And however, I think it should be, you're right, it should be across the board. I know I also work as a pharmacist in hospital, and I know where high risk decisions are made, particularly in the emergency department, and we need the consent of the patient, and that often requires an interpreter to actually explain what the outcomes will be. And in that instance, we actually have access to online interpreters that are hired by the hospital itself. So that's another way that we can access them very quickly, particularly in high risk situations. But there is a document by the Judicial Council on Cultural Diversity, which I'd highly recommend for lawyers to have a look at, as well as barristers, which provides recommended national standards for working with interpreters, but it's only in courts and tribunals. So it doesn't actually talk about, interviewing a client on their first interview when they come and see you and explain, and you realize that they're in a family violence situation, as well as, for instance, my first example, they're also, work relationships are illegal. They're also need a visa because they've just arrived. So I think it's important, like you said, that we also do a lot more work in engaging lawyers and barristers on the ground level to actually be more aware of and how to actually respond to these cases as well. Even referral, like where to refer clients who you realize are in family violence situations. Where do we send them? And when's a good time to actually tell them? Like, do you tell them while the client's husband is downstairs? Or so just stuff like that, very simple stuff that I think would be very beneficial within the legal system.
Really emphasizes the need for collaboration as more of a systems response here, doesn't it? But I have to say, legal practitioners have kind of been the last to join the campaign around law reform and working effectively with language services. So thank you, Emily. I note that there are a number of participants from bodies like the Law Institute Victoria, and also one or two from the Owen Dixon Chambers. So getting to the Victorian Bar, making sure that the Law Institute, all of these bodies who have such influence in the industry could really play a vital role. So I want to encourage that engagement beyond today with bodies like that, because in 2024 we really shouldn't be having the same conversations over and over again. Can I try and take up some of these questions that are being put to us? Eva, we have specialised interpreters in courts and medical settings. Why can't we have specialised interpreters in the family violence sector? Do you see a possibility where that training could be embedded as part of a mandatory process?
I would love that. It's just a difficult thing to do because of how fragmented the industry is. So, for example, in the frameworks that Tanya's mentioned and Asunta just emailed me, it would be great for every single interpreter to know this, but the reality is that it's a very transactional.
Yeah,
that's right. It's a very transactional space. So in other words, in reality, what happens is that nowadays through apps, you'll get booking requests. You don't know where you're going. I mean, you know the address and maybe the client's name, but you don't have any information about the background, you know, for safety and confidentiality reasons sometimes, but there's no training that interpreters can tap in where we can say they are trained and the training is ongoing and current across the board, because none of this is compulsory. So once you get certified by NAATI, as long as you provide proof of professional practice and professional development, you get recertified. So there's really no mechanism other than people making complaints, which is what Maha alluded to with police officers. But people often don't know where the interpreters come from because there's some big system in the cloud, and they don't want people to get into trouble. But unfortunately, it is the only mechanism, and also put pressure on the language service providers that, you know, if you're sending an interpreter, they must be trained at least at a basic level. But, you know, in an ideal world, people would specialize and understand all the nuances and all the sensitivities about working in this space. Certainly, there are some interpreters that are very committed to that, but others, like I said, are transactional, turn up and go home.
Absolutely. I really do want to encourage people to type in any questions that they might have, because I'm conscious of time. And as I say, I've tried to integrate some of the comments and questions that are coming through the chat session. But we talked earlier, Maha, about the importance of police not relying solely on or at all on the alleged perpetrator to interpret. But one of our participants has said, well, what about interpreters though for perpetrators? I mean, this is important and it's worth being very aware of. Are there any sort of insights that you can offer around that? Again, I know you made comment about police being very cognizant of both parties here, but are there any insights you can offer around, look, just as importantly, the alleged perpetrator also needs to have an interpreter in some situations?
Well, it's his human rights and their human rights to have an interpreter. We have to organize it both ways. In any case, can I give some statistics while I have you?
Yeah.
In 2022, up to 44% of the family violence that police attended were people who needed interpreters.
44%.
44%. So this is 2022. So I don't have the latest numbers. But out of the 44, usually an average in 2022, when police process offenders or perpetrators in this case, when it comes to family violence, our processing rate is about 75% for English speakers. Right. It drops down to 51% for non-English speakers.
Okay.
For a lot of reasons, including not trusting, not having the right interpreters, not scared of police, scared of the person who's going to go talk to things in the public about their private lives. So there's a lot of that nuances in the back that you've all been talking about that needs to be addressed as well, from our perspective, from different perspective. From the policing perspective, again, I'm talking about me from my experience and from what I've seen in the last 20 years, and being an RT qualified myself. Eva's 100% right. Once you're naughty, you're naughty. You can't pick and choose. You can't, if you choose to teach yourself and go and do courses, perfect. But they don't make you, do courses and update yourself. And using my engaging the interpreting services through the different companies, you can't. There's only picking the language. You can't pick language and what they know or what. So maybe that's something that needs to be introduced.
Yeah.
So
and
there
Maha,
is
sometimes just in terms of that practice, and I see it across the board within the legal system, the lack of understanding though around how language works, or how you even identify the language. I still get various, players in the legal process ringing me up and saying, "Oh, look, I need an Indian interpreter." And I will say, well, you realize there's no such language as Indian. What are you looking for? So there's a problem too there, isn't there? That even in the process around inquiring, we talk about getting the right dialect. Sometimes I find people don't even understand the difference between nationality, ethnicity, and language requirements.
exactly.
India is a very large country with many, many different languages. Can you tell me what language you're looking for? How do we get professionals to really understand? It's not just nuanced, it's actually a very fundamental part of our knowledge base, surely.
It's unconscious bias or conscious bias. I don't know what you're going to call it as well. In what cases? I'll give you Arabic, okay? Someone who's Lebanese, they don't want an Iraqi interpreter. It's completely different kettle of fish when it comes to dialects and different ways of speaking things. Or if someone's Iraqi, they don't want me to translate because I'm Lebanese Arabic, which they have different words and different things. So there is a lot. So encouragement from both sides. We'll work with the police perspective, and there's a lot of policies. There's a huge policy in Victoria Police, and I can't talk about changing policies myself, but about utilizing interpreters. When do you use them? How do you use them? There's good practice and best practice, and there's the mandation as well of using the interpreters. But maybe we need to do more work about how and training how we start using utilizing interpreters. Excuse me again. I need to teach myself that.
No, but Maha, can I say what, over the 25 years plus that we've worked with you in the family violence sector, you've been such an incredible asset in terms of, that negotiation with the system that sometimes even people like myself don't necessarily understand. So keep it up, because it's people like you that really do make a difference to
Thank
lives.
You.
Yeah.
Can I say one more thing, Emily, in regarding to your case? Can we talk offline? This is considered human trafficking and forced thingies. Let's talk. There's ways around things in here.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I know the work that you've done around forced marriage, human trafficking, and so on, and how vital it is that language services are engaged. Tan, I was going to ask you, and I know you've got your hand up, but just on that theme of perpetrators and access to language services, can I just ask you before you offer any other comment? I know one of the things that the courts have said to me, or judicial officers have said to me, is that the sector out there isn't terribly great when it comes to behaviour change programs for men and utilising language services. And sadly, the judicial officer might be limited in the recommendation they make around diversionary programs or access to these programs when they don't utilise interpreters for their own reasons. Is that still an issue?
Yeah, I think this is a complicated issue because I'm not sure the way in which programs would be accessible for people from other cultures, not just language. It's the whole way you structure the program. Okay. And I think where they have had real success is when they have developed it based with the community. So, for example, In Touch, which you know is a multicultural service, and because you used to work at its predecessor, they have done some really amazing work with Arabic language program and behaviour change programs, and they've had a really amazing retention rate. You know, it seems to exceed even the mainstream programs. So I wonder also if we not have to think about not just immediate interpretation of language, but also what are some of those other, you know, kind of social cultural norms you have to consider when you're pulling these programs together. And the point I wanted to make was more and more the sector is hiring bicultural workers, you know, and I think it's really impacting the culture in the sector about understanding, you know, some of those unique aspects for people for whom language is not their first language, and some of those other, and they may be good conduits for this engagement with interpreters over time. So I was thinking about some of that, and that might be something we can talk about with the language service providers about how we could maybe facilitate more engagement with domestic violence services. But the other thing I was thinking about, and I can't help but not get away from, is if we can do accreditation process for medical and pharmaceutical and some of those things, and there is no reason why we cannot do it for family violence. We just need will and funding and resources. And I was thinking about all the efforts that have been made under the national, I mean, obviously these accreditation models sit federally, not very often at the state territory jurisdiction. But it would be really good if maybe we could together do some work to advocate to the federal government in the work they're doing under the national plan about some of these issues about accessibility of services and legal programs and things for people. So it won't matter if you provide support to communities if they can't access the system that's going to make them safe. So we really need to do some advocacy at the national level to get the will and the resources to maybe do something around an accreditation program.
Sounds like a campaign, Eva Hussein. What do you think?
Yes, I just wanted to clap as Tanya was speaking and cheer because it is indeed something that could make a really big difference. So even if we get a baseline of interpreters who have been through the training, I think it'll elevate the quality of services, but also outcomes for people. And yes, it's hard, but interpreting is hard. You know, working across languages is hard. Nobody said this is going to be easy. So I think we just need to have the drive and government support essentially to say, look, there's a business case in that. So it feels like they're nearly looking for some sort of a validation where they can say, or we can say, somebody can say, look, if we invest into the industry, this is what it's going to mean to victim survivors, to children, to perpetrators, to whoever, to the legal system. Because if we expose people to risk every day, and if we send untrained interpreters, the legal outcomes and health outcomes and all of that for people, you know, like me, 1987, will not be as good as they could be if the interpreters are well trained.
Absolutely, there's considerable risk associated. Look, I'm very conscious of time, but we're also fortunate that Mariam, you've had quite a journey in getting here, I understand. So thank you for joining us. How are you doing? What a journey you've had. Look, we are nearing time, Mariam, but
I know.
I did want to give you the last word, if you like, if anybody else wants to join in. But at this stage, you've heard some of it, I realise, but if we were going to provide a more holistic, systemic response that does meet the needs, particularly of victim survivors and alleged perpetrators in our diverse communities, from your perspective as someone who is a community leader, who is a professional working in the area, what would your recommendations be?
Oh, well, first of all, thank you, Maria and everybody. And I'm sorry I've been late today in Washington. The date is 22nd. So thank God for the Yeah, I just had some calls and I realized that it's today. But anyway, well, as you said, Maria, there are a lot of ground up work, bottom up work needs to be done within the community places where the resources, and regardless of how perfectly, how beautifully those materials are translated, doesn't get, there are places that I have worked with as a domestic violence worker, as a caseworker, and also in a specialized role for 12 years. The places that I really recommend that we need to kind of go and advocate and educate are the hairdressers, mosques, women's gathering organizations that are around group, not just the way it happens, and I have done it even myself, to wait in the office, wait for the victims to come, and then start the process of how to get them to the right places, to the right workers, to the right resources. There are wonderful workers, there are wonderful resources, there are wonderful materials. But the communities that I have worked, which was Afghan, South Sudanese, and Indian for 12 years, the literacy level was so low, regardless of what we did in terms of translating the materials. There was still there was no human touch. They weren't very humanized, those materials, for them to go and read and feel safe and understand them, and also the process that what happens after you go. So there are normally some of the brochures has the contact details, the referral details, the warning sign, the other aspects of what domestic violence looks like, but it doesn't have a bit of more understanding or concept that what's going to happen when you leave home, what's going to happen when you have 5 children, where are those conditions on those shelters that you might go and seek help. Because on one hand, a lot of times when we do advocacy, when we do information session, when we do support to women, we encourage them to be safe, we encourage them to be brave, we encourage them to come and speak up. But on the other side of the fence, we haven't, from my perspective, from what I have seen in the sector, we haven't done enough systematically to see what is the medium to long-term kind of journey will look like for a woman that is from a multicultural background and she has 5 kids. And there are a lot of women that have more than 2 kids that accommodating them are extremely difficult. The process is not verbalized, or not every multicultural worker and mainstream organization are equipped enough to go and tell them that's what's going to happen. They go and get those basic information. They get so encouraged, they get so confident to get out of those violent relationships. The minute they gone out, there is nothing. And currently, even with the legal system, with Legal Aid in Sydney, I had a bit of, I should say, conflict of views on how much a women that recently, this is a real case, a woman that recently came to Australia, the husband, both the husband and wife recently came to Australia. The husband couldn't speak English, already had his friends, got his materials translated, got a solicitor and everything. For the women that she couldn't speak, she went to the police, she went to the legal aid. The way she approached it was very fragile, it was very naive, it was very uninformed. Nobody translated the materials that she presented to put it in her case. I did it despite that I don't have at the moment, I'm not a caseworker, I'm not a prevention officer, but the work that we're doing with the Combank, with their prevention work on family and domestic violence, I had to translate, I had to go and challenge legal aid people within this space to say that this was not done. Once we have done it, the whole case changed. One woman with 2 children, with the whole community watching them, was big issue if it was unseen and unheard. Absolutely. So imagine how many women, how many families are going under those,
And sadly, Mariam, we don't need to imagine. Sadly, it happens every single day. And I think what we've tried to achieve with this panel is to really amplify the fact that this just isn't good enough. I think that the voices of multicultural communities around this issue have been, you know, on and on about this issue for so long. The fact that we've even had to host an event like this one, where again we're identifying those gaps, we're recommending strategies that are not necessarily new, that we've tried to highlight over a very long period of time. I thank all of you, because I think that we do this work because we absolutely believe that change is possible, that we know that the implementation of the range of suggestions that each of you have made can really enhance the outcomes ultimately for victim survivors of family violence. So I want to thank each of you, Eva, Mariam, Tanya, Maha, and of course Emily, for your incredible dedication on a daily basis. You keep butting up against the system but refuse to be dissuaded from the work that you do. We're certainly very grateful. Eva, I don't know if you wanted to make any final comments. Mariam, congratulations. I understand you're at Harvard right now. Well done.
Thank you.
So thank you for taking the time. It's not often I can say.
Thank you. My brain is
Let's go
not
across
working.
To Washington, shall we?
Thank you.
Fancy.
Thank you, Mary. Just if I put one more comment here, because I was thinking even to say this, with the assumption on when we promote domestic violence in cult communities and multicultural communities, there is assumption that there are women with multicultural women with scarf looks like in this space, right? So there's a lot of materials that I have seen that when they were talking about multicultural women, Muslim women, it is with scarf. I have clients that they look not Muslim, they not look that particular way of the way we see it, or I see it even myself, just to kind of balance that images of that materials that we are going to work on from both translation material and I'm a bit lost.
Stereotypes abound, unfortunately, and they still feature in so many of the materials that we see. So an important point to end on, Eva. I'll hand it over to you. But
I'll have the last word by thanking you, Maria, for a lifetime of passionate work and advocacy, and for getting these amazing women together to talk about important topics like domestic and family violence. And thank you for to everybody for attending. And we will take this conversation further. So thanks, everyone.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and have a good night. Thank you, bye.